everyone. Welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Something significant is underway, ongoing as we speak here in Beijing regarding Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to China, a two-day official visit, and he is there in China. We have seen a number of important developments on the first day of his visit over there in China. This particular visit happens to be significant, especially when we talk about President Vladimir Putin becoming a Russian president for a record fifth term, and China happens to be his first stop right after his inauguration and this particular visit abroad. Today, he was warmly welcomed outside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, and he and President Xi Jinping had the closed-door meeting. Also, they signed a joint statement on deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership. Also, both the leaders have hailed their ties as stabilizing force in the chaotic world. Both the leaders also addressed a joint presser. I'll be bringing in some important and significant excerpts from what both the leaders had to say during that presser. Firstly, Chinese President Xi Jinping said, let me quote, "Ties between Beijing and Moscow are a model of relations between large powers and neighboring states, characterized by mutual respect, trust, friendship, and mutual benefit." Russian President Vladimir Putin said, let me quote, "Our cooperation in the world affairs is one of the main stabilizing factors on the international stage. China and Russia both defend the principles of fairness and the democratic world order based on multipolar realities and international law." Another significant point made by President Xi Jinping, saying that Cold War mentality remained rampant in the international arena and unilateral hegemony, bloc confrontation, and power politics directly threaten the whole world and security of all countries, unquote. President Putin said Asia Pacific has no place for the closed military and political alliances. President Putin has also backed China's genuine desire of resolving the Ukraine conflict through peaceful means during his interview with Chinese state media. Also, we saw a statement that came from NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg regarding China. What he deems is that China enabling Russia in its conflict with Ukraine. We'll be taking all these important statements made by the two leaders and also the latest developments as far as the China and Russia relationship is concerned. What sort of a message is being received in the West? For that, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Mr. Saleem, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Also in the studio, we are honored to have been joined by Mr. Mohammad Zamir Assadi. He's a journalist and expert China affairs. Mr. Assadi, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. On Skype, at the same time, we are honored to have been joined by Ms. Zoon Ahmad Khan. She's a research fellow, Center for China and Globalization. Mr. Zoon, Ms. Zoon, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Mr. Jauhar Saleem, now talking about this particular development, this is the first foreign visit on the part of President Vladimir Putin, going straight away to China. And the kind of statements during the interaction between both the leaders that have come forth, I'll be taking your analysis on that also, but the significance and the timing of this particular engagement, what's your understanding?
Yes, it's very important because at the inception of what's going to be his fifth term, President Putin's fifth term in office, he has chosen to make China his first foreign visit. So that shows the importance that Russia is now paying to its relations with China. Now, this relationship, which is now very important, these are the second and third most powerful countries in the world by sort of, many measures. And China is economically the closest economy to the US in the world. What we have seen in recent years, it's very interesting. Historically, Soviet Union was one of the first countries to recognize China, and since then they've had, in the beginning, a very close and cooperative relationship. But in the 60s, the two countries drifted apart. They even had some border issues. Following the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, the two countries in 1992, they started what is called a constructive partnership. They sorted out their like the border problems, and then set in motion certain principles for enhancing their friendship and cooperation. In 1996, they upgraded that to what they call a strategic partnership. Then in 2001, they signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation. Now that treaty was seen as the West as in effect some sort of a military pact as well. Since then, President Putin has been in power, and he has especially been very instrumental in building yet closer relations with China. Since 2013, with President Xi together, I think they brought this relationship, which does not encompass only defense or strategic cooperation, but now economic cooperation to a very large extent. For instance, in 2023, the trade between two countries rose to $240 billion. That was many times the trade that they had just 6 or 7 years back in 2016 or 17. Their trade was about $70 billion. So part of the reason is Ukraine war, because following the Ukraine war, the Russians faced a lot of sanctions, and it became much harder for them to obtain a lot of commodities, particularly products, high-tech products, spare parts, components for the defense products, a range of products which China is now providing them. Now the West is not particularly happy about that, so if they tried again and again to pressurize China to desist from that. America has sanctioned some Chinese companies which provide certain parts or certain components to the Russian companies which could be used in defense-related industries. But the Chinese have chosen to stay steadfast on the course to forging closer and closer partnership with the Russians. And why is that? Because both China and Russia feel threatened by the US. So far as China is concerned, they feel that the US is now basically trying to, they're embarked upon a containment policy, such as that they had against the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s and the following decades. And they're trying to squeeze China economically as well strategically. The Russians feel that the West, they feel that there was a tacit understanding between them and the West that the former Soviet states would stay as the sphere of influence of what is now Russia. And they believe that the Western countries, particularly the US, by absorbing some of those countries into NATO, they have violated that tacit agreement. And they feel threatened. Russians feel, because they feel Ukraine. And Ukraine, we have to remember, Ukraine is where the whole Russian that's where the origins of Russian empires can be traced to. So in this type of a situation where both these countries feel threatened by the US and by the West in general, they're forging closer and closer linkages. And this visit coming at the very inception of Putin's 5th term shows very clearly the intent of the two countries. First of all, not to take into consideration the Western pressure. We have to remember in recent weeks, Secretary of State Blinken visited China. And he tried to pressurize China to stop supporting Russia indirectly in the war effort against Ukraine. And as we all know, in Ukraine the situation has changed quite a bit now. Now it's the Russian troops which are advancing on many sectors, and the West, which is supporting Ukraine, they are feeling very much concerned about that. And so they're trying to put pressure everywhere, wherever they can, so to stop the momentum of Russia's sort of,
So it's natural for both of countries to forge a closer ties because of that threat towards China. It comes to the containment of the U.S. containment policy, containing China economically, and the expansion of NATO as far as Russia is concerned. A number of other important aspects.
And in the Indo-Pacific strategy, being employed by the U.S.
There is a statement made by Russian president regarding that also. I'll be taking your detailed view regarding in the next round. Mr. Assadi, now when we talk about the stabilizing factor, this particular bilateral relationship between Russia and China bring to the world, what do you understand of that? Because this particular relationship during today's summit between President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin has been hailed as a stabilizing factor on the world arena.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, it must be very clear for the international community, and they are really very well aware of the fact that anytime when the Russian leadership or the Chinese leadership, if the Russian leadership is visiting Beijing or the Chinese leadership is visiting Moscow, is very important, very significant, and that really gets the international attention. And it's not the attention from the international leadership, but it also gets the international attention from the international media as well. Because why is that? Because these are the two countries that are really playing an important role as far as the economic engine of the international community is concerned. Specifically, if we talk about China is a country right now that is contributing 30% of the global economy. So international community is really interested to know what China is doing. So any of the international community leader, any of the international leader is visiting China is a news. So right now the Russian leader, Mr. President Putin, is visiting China is definitely is a news for the international community, because now they have really got the signal that the economic engines of the future, they are really aligning together, and the economic movement or the economic vibrance will be coming from these two nations that will be providing the economic you can say the injections to the global economy as well. And as far as the global
what I need to understand from you is that as you already mentioned, that China's economies to the contribution to the global economy remains to be 30%, and now Russia and China are coming closer as far as their economic cooperation is concerned. We all know for a fact that is indeed under scrutiny when it comes to the collective West's approach towards that. But what makes this bilateral relationship a stabilizing force in the world arena? What's your understanding? What sense do you make out of this statement?
Definitely, right now, why they are talking about that our relationship is a stabilizing factor, because these two nations are providing an alternative factor, an alternative approach to the international community, and this visit is really telling the international community that right now Americans or the Westerns, you are not only dependent on those Western blocs or the Americans for your economy, for your future, or for your, if you want to move on and if you want to attract the investment from the international community. These are the two countries that may have the potential, that are capable of, and that are having the investments for your countries, especially for the developing countries. And definitely, and this is the time when when all of the world we are witnessing and we are observing that the world is moving towards the alternate you can say you can say the elements of the international community, right? Like the Washington or the Westerns, they are feeling threatened that that this kind of a relationship that Beijing and Moscow they are developing with the passage of the time is going to threaten or is going to counter their hegemony. And the Beijing and the Moscow, they are sitting together, the President Xi and the Putin, and they are generating the message that the gone are the days when the hegemony and will be like dominating the international politics. So I think this is the meaning of the stabilizing factor is that now the international community have the alternate the approaches, and if they want to move on, they have different kind of the international capitals for which they can move on. They can they can forge on the different relationships, the vibrant relationships, the comprehensive partner strategic partnerships, and they can get different options and the give and the different viable factors as well for the future as well.
Your point is well taken. Let me proceed with the discussion. Ms. Zoon, when we talk about both the countries back in 2022 declaring the no-limit partnership as far as the bilateral relationship between China and Russia is concerned. Now, this particular engagement, right after the inauguration of Russian President Vladimir Putin for a record 5th term, how much do you think this particular engagement consolidate that very idea of no-limit partnership between the two countries?
Well, thank you firstly for having me on the program. I perfectly, first of all, like both our previous guests, panelists have explained, the historic context and also the fact that Russia and China, their own perception is also that they are playing a very important role in a multipolarizing world, right? And I just quickly, before I come to, before I respond to your question, I think I just also want to add a bit to the context that, the consciousness that imperialism is not conducive to an inclusive global society has existed since the 1950s. And the fact that, today Russia and China, along with, other increasing initiatives, multilateralism in the global south, are playing a role to counter the impunity with which Western imperialism can exert itself is perhaps, one of the most transformative developments we are seeing today. So that said, I completely resonate with what the previous two speakers were talking about. Yes, China and Russia have had a complex relationship. In fact, just like Mr. Jauhar mentioned, the 1960s complications of the relationship were also partially what resulted in the US-China detente. And gradually, we saw this relationship not only normalize after that, but also become very significant to both. What I see of this visit is that firstly, it comes as no surprise. China has positioned itself not only as a very central player to the Eurasian region that Russia is also a very important part of, but also has, through its global security initiative as well, tried to play a role in reducing the degree of escalations we see. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, or whatever people want to call it, it seems at this point that China is the one country that can play a conducive role in that. And with President Xi, I mentioned this because President Xi just wrapped his China-European visit, where a very important meeting between him, Macron, and Ursula took place, in which they decided, that something needs to move forward. So the fact that this visit of Putin, his first international visit since his fifth election happens in Beijing, is also very significant, and it can lead to some movement, in that direction to perhaps play a role in a conducive dialogue. That said, it is also the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Mr. Jauhar already mentioned how the economic relationship has improved over the years. It has been on a positive trajectory since 2000, since the SCO started as well. But what we see is that right now the Harbin Expo, the China-Russia Harbin Expo, is also taking place today as we speak, just as Putin has landed in Beijing. This is another opportunity where more than 44 countries are participating and thousands of delegates are participating. It's another effort for Russia also to diversify, to develop itself, and to enter certain markets via China, maybe towards East Asia, etc. There are multiple dimensions. It's also, one interesting article that I recently worked on with the Chinese media was also how Russia has been also trying to pitch its Eurasian Economic Union initiative, which was proposed in 2015, if I'm not wrong. And it's also an infrastructure connectivity initiative through Eurasia, how that is being pitched to sort of align with the Belt and Road Initiative. So maybe these meetings that are taking place and this enhancement in the relationship, where, they're talking about infrastructure cooperation, transportation, creating more linkages, cultural, academic, etc. I mean, all of that, maybe on some level, there could be an understanding. Will the Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI somewhat align? There's anyway, many facets to this development. The relationship is significant, like was previously said. When Xi and Putin meet, the world watches, the world notices, and I think just the fact that they both are trying to deepen cooperation, but also are playing a very important role through BRICS, through SCO, through even the UN Security Council, so to speak, to play a balancing role. Is something that makes the importance of this relationship more. But what precisely, apart from enhanced commitment, we can achieve? I mean, how much can the trade further increase? Exactly what role can Beijing play in reducing the escalations and actually maybe potentially resulting in a ceasefire in Russia-Ukraine conflict? It's too soon to predict.
I'll take your detailed view regarding as to China's position regarding the Ukraine conflict is concerned. Also, we saw just 2 days before this particularly important visit, the interview of President Vladimir Putin being published in China's state media, backing China's position when it proposed those 12 points regarding the peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. Mr. Jauhar, when we talk about no limits partnership, as you have already very comprehensively in your first take talked about how this particular bilateral relationship over the years has evolved. In 2022, the No Limits Partnership was declared. We've seen these both leaders meeting for the 43rd time this time around. This is the 43rd meeting, quite a number when it comes to the high-level engagements between the leaders. Now, No Limits Partnership, what does that basically actually signify? Are there no limits at all? Everything is open between China and Russia. And when such type of engagements are happening back and forth, what sort of a message is being received in the West?
Yeah, that's, I think what's important here is the personal rapport that has been built between President Putin and President Xi over the years. And we have to remember that in these countries, these are two very powerful figures. And President Putin has been powerful 2 decades, and President Xi has been in power for more than a decade. So this type of personal rapport between them, given the the understanding between the countries, given the fact that in terms of the geostrategics that we see, geopolitics that we see today, these two countries' interests are so very much aligned. This personal rapport builds upon that. When they say no limits partnership, for instance, before they use the term constructive partnership, then strategic partnership, then time-tested partnership, then no limit. Okay, this is diplomatic parlance. You could come up with more and more expressions. But what you have to see in actuality is what is happening on the ground in terms of cooperation. What type of defense cooperation they are having, what type of economic cooperation they are having, what type of cooperation they are having in the international fora. The Zoon has made some very good points. We have seen all around and across the board cooperative framework between these two countries in practice in recent years. And the primary reason is that the interests of these two major powers in the world, they're so very much aligned. And they both feel that the West is not being very fair, and they both feel that in the Western strategic plans, there is, they don't really get the space that they deserve, the space in terms of growing economically. For instance, for China, they're using this, the American strategy of decoupling, and in the recent years, China has been squeezed because of that. We have seen in many areas, Russia has been facing sanctions, and those sanctions have really strangulated its economy, and not just economy, but travel by many of business leaders, travel by some political leaders or officials as well, in many areas. So in this type of a situation, these two countries, which have huge, China has a huge economy, Russia also, and Russia is a very, in terms of natural resources, it's one of the richest countries in the world, particularly in terms of hydrocarbon resources, and China needs that. So there are so many complementarities between these two countries. Now, in terms of, because you had mentioned that, and Zoon had mentioned that as well, President Xi's peace plan for Ukraine. Now, that is very interesting. This idea was floated about a year ago, and incidentally, at that time, the reaction from the West, from the US, was very lukewarm, but also the reaction from Russia was very lukewarm, But now, this time, President Putin has made a point to say again and again that he endorses that plan. Now, what is that plan? If you look at those 12 points, there's not a plan actually. What you see there are principles. For instance, first principle is respecting the sovereignty of countries. The second principle is abandoning the Cold War mentality. The third principle is ceasing the hostilities. The fourth principles would be, the other principles are not attacking each other's nuclear installations, then allowing the grain shipments to go on. These type of principles. But what those principles can do is they can build a conducive environment whereby you could have negotiations, whereby Russia and Ukraine and the other countries involved, they could have, and we have to remember there were negotiations priorly in Istanbul, for instance, and certain understandings were arrived at, and Russia, alleges that Ukraine, it backtracked from those understandings, and that is why, Russia alleges that the war, continued and intensified. So I think this is very significant that Russia is now, for a plan that it was initially not very excited about, is now making it a point to sort of, repeat that they back that plan, So
after Russia giving that backing, now this time around so openly and repeatedly, now this time around, what are the chances of this particular conflict being resolved in the near future, in particular?
I think what we see on the battlefront now is that Russian troops have been advancing in recent times. And that has not been easy for Russia. They have put in a lot of resources, not just the material resources, not just their own human resources, but there are media reports accusing that, even sort of, the people from other countries are fighting there now. So the point is, and that is, historically we have seen that in many wars, when Russia enters the wars, in the beginning they don't really do very well. But as the war progresses, the Russians are known to come up with very strong resistance and then turning the tide. We had seen that in the Second World War in particular. We'd seen that in some other wars as well. So this, if you see the course of the war in Ukraine, right now it is not going to the liking of Ukrainians or the Western countries. Now, but what would Russia demand in terms of, let's say, if there has to be some peace negotiations and everything? There was a time, like perhaps a year ago or sort of, in between as well, when Russians wanted to negotiate, and because at that time, what they felt was that what they have already Crimea, they also have some parts of Ukraine that they laid a claim to. They already have, they have those parts under their control. So they felt that any negotiation at that point would allow them to perhaps keep all that, and sort of, that's perhaps what they wanted. And certain understandings from the West, as for instance, that Ukraine would not become a member of the NATO, and understandings in the same realm. But at that time, the Ukrainians, and their Western backers, they felt that if Ukraine is able to push the Russians back and out of all those, what they call the occupied, and of course, the areas under Russian control within Ukraine, then that would be the time to negotiate from a stronger position, where then, basically it would be, about Ukraine's independence. It will be about the fact that none of the Ukrainian territory would stay under Russian control. So, but currently, what we see is, I don't really see a great deal of incentive
for
either the Ukrainians or the Russians to stop here, to have a ceasefire and start negotiating. Perhaps in the coming months, depending upon how the sort of how the momentum shifts, or how the momentum strengthens, because right now the momentum is on the side of the Russians. So I think, but for the time being, I perceive it to be a little difficult.
Right, Mr. Assadi, we've seen some high-ranking U.S. officials, and now this statement that has come from NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg also accusing China of enabling Russia to go ahead with its what it says as aggression or war in Ukraine. We've seen there has been a continuous support on the part of the U.S. when it comes to the military aid provision to Ukraine, but accusation at the same time accusing China of providing lethal weapons to Russia without any solid proof or concrete evidence. How do you analyze the balance of this equation? On one side, you're providing Ukrainians yourself the weapons and the aid, and on the other side, accusing China. Isn't it a deliberate attempt to drag China also into a conflict of which it is not a part of?
Definitely, that is the point which Chinese officials, Chinese Foreign Office, or the Chinese leadership is repeatedly talking about. And they have maintained their position as far as this Russia and the Ukraine conflict is concerned. And we have also witnessed this this kind of a situation where United States and the other European countries they are sending weapons not only to the Ukrainians against the Russians. They are also providing weapons to the if we talk about the Middle East crisis, they are also providing weapons there. So this is the kind of the dual standard in the international relations that the China has maintained its position, and China have talked about it, that we are not those guys who are trying to damage or destroy the peace and the security in the region. Either it is about Russia or the Ukraine conflict, or it is about the Middle East crisis. So I think China has come up with a very unique position, and China has responded it very peacefully. And if you gone through the statements of the Chinese Foreign Office on the weekly basis, either on the regular basis, the statements that are coming from the Chinese Foreign Office, they have maintained these positions that we are the guys, we are the country that are maintaining or upgrading our economic partnership or a relationship with the Russians, and you are no one to tell us that we should degrade or downgrade our economic relationship with Russia.
In that particular context, Mr. Assadi, shouldn't it naturally make the West collectively more concerned about the growing partnership between Russia and China, given the fact that they are already aiming at containing China economically? Also, when we talk about the Ukraine conflict and raging, they are looking forward to have an expansion of NATO. So when these two countries are coming together in order to dismantle all those aims of the collective West, so this particular partnership growing closer with each single passing day, shouldn't it be giving more concern to the collective West? And what could be the possible repercussions when it comes to the response from the West subsequently?
I think this is a situation when China, the mayors of the China are generating a signal for the international community that our foreign policy cannot be pressurized, whether it is our relationship with Russia or whether it is our relationship with Iran. We are having our independent foreign policy, and we are independent to develop and to forge our relationship with any of
the point is well taken. I've understood that point. I just want you to elaborate on what sort of a reaction could be expected when it comes to the collective West's understanding of this rapidly developing partnership between Russia and China?
Definitely, the replications or the response of the Westerns as far as China or Russia is concerned, I think they will not be going to the extent where they will be, engaging with China in any of the military conflict or in any of the conflict that will not be able to to control in the future. Right now, although there are some kind of the measures that Americans, if you talk about the Taiwan, they are doing some kind of things that the international community thinks that Americans or the Westerns, they are trying to engage China militarily in Taiwan. But they are very well aware that if the military engagement with China, they are going to do it, then definitely this is the time when all of the international community or the researchers or the experts or the think tanks, they are talking about it, that then we all are expecting that there will be a large scale war in the international community or the global scale or the World War III maybe, if you talk about that. So I think the West is very well aware that any kind of the relationship with China or US or any kind of a partnership with China or the Russia may happen in the future. These kind of a relationship may expand in the future as well, but the Westerns or the US, they will definitely have to tolerate it, and they will have to restrain their approach towards China or and the Russia relationship. Otherwise, definitely the situation will be out of control if they think that they can militarily engage China.
Right, Ms. Zoon, when we talk about the interview that was published in Chinese state media of President Vladimir Putin, let me quote an excerpt from it, if you allow me. "We commend China's approaches to resolving the crisis in Ukraine. Beijing is well aware of its root causes and the global geopolitical significance, which is reflected in its 12-point plan entitled China's Position on the Political Settlement of the Ukraine Crisis, published in February 2023. The ideas and the proposals contained in the document show the genuine desire of our Chinese friends to help stabilize the situation." Now, this sort of a statement coming from President Vladimir Putin, where should we be expecting when this particular conflict could be resolved, when he is appreciating what China's intentions are and what his own intentions are also, which he made public at his inauguration address as well, and during this particular interview also, that Russia stands ready for negotiations?
No, this also ties in very well with your previous question about, what are the incentives for each side, right? So how Putin is responding to that CGTN interview with Wang Wan, right? That's the one you're referring to. What does that response have to do with his expectations of the other side, which is, as we call it, the West, but we also know that the West is not a monolith. So I'll try to be first of all, I think what's happened in recent months is that we saw also President Macron's visit to Beijing, where the expression, the confidence with which he expressed that we recognize China's role and the global South's role. And I think that recognition, comes with also came with a degree of recognition of China's potential role. And this is a calculation, this is something that President Putin is also observing. And again, as I mentioned, the China-Europe visit was also quite successful. The extent to which China can actually play a role, and China's principles, which do resonate with Russia, with Putin's Russia. To what extent can they actually, result in a positive outcome? So I think what Putin is saying is obviously, maybe after a year, we also saw, for example, last year, the Saudi-Iran détente. That was the first demonstration of the 12-point peace plan, or the principles which also make the global security initiative. And all of this, is creating an environment where the Russians, as well as the Europeans, to some extent, some countries in Europe may be coming closer to a solution. And I think one of the major reasons for that is, no, the West is not a monolith. Not every country in Europe, whether we talk about the Central and Eastern European countries, whether we talk about the EU, the UK is obviously completely independent of that in some ways, but does it truly represent Europe? And to what extent, Can European capitals, EU capitals, rely on what can come of what can the policy towards EU be if there is a Trump presidency? I think all of this is playing a role. So we recently also saw that Germany has increased its defense budget to 3%. And I think that's a projection that maybe the EU will have to be a bit more independent and cannot rely on American support. And this situation also results in perhaps an increasing likelihood of European countries to engage in the possibility of negotiations with Russia, and Russia's response is perhaps a result of that. So I think genuinely the prolonged conflict in Ukraine doesn't benefit Russia. Russia is, as Mr. Jauhar mentioned as well, there are economic consequences of where Russia stands today. And this is being discussed, even in Chinese social media or by Chinese analysts, that one of the major takeaways of this trip can be how can further economic relations be boosted? How can what the price Russia is paying for this relative, status quo in Ukraine, this relative, we can't call it a victory, but a position of relative strength in some ways. The price is an economic one. And that is where also China is playing a critical role. So I think when we look at all of that, the West is shifting maybe slightly. China's importance is increasing to the West, to Russia, to developing countries. And as another, analyst pointed out, that at this point, China is the only country that is hosting both Putin and Western leaders like Macron or Ursula, right? So this is a fascinating period to witness. And let's see, I think people in Beijing, there's also, I think one thing interesting to notice is that within Chinese, analysts as well, there are views, okay, should we be closer to, should we support the West in this point? Should we support Russia? But I think the bigger consensus is that at this point, China does not need to pick sides. There is no need to pick any side, because neither Russia nor the West can do without China to begin with, right? So what China should do is play a non-partisan, a neutral, a moral role, which is I think many would agree that China has continued economic cooperation with the West, with Russia. China is not supporting through weapons Russia's involvement in Ukraine, which is contrary to what Western countries are doing for Ukraine. And at the same time, China is promoting its vision through the GSI, the BRI, the GDI, all of that, and Russia is a part of that vision.
Right.
I'll stop here. I think I've gone too long.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive and very insightful take that you've given us. Mr. Jauhar Saleem, when we talk about the economic ties between Russia and China, amid that Western scrutiny about this economic relationship, how do you think it's going to evolve? What's the potential? As you've already mentioned that it has gone up to 240 billions back in 2023. Firstly, and secondly, with those measures, the Westerns, particularly the US, resorts to when it comes to bringing in new tariffs, when it comes to China's goods, doesn't that in turn affect the economy of the US also?
Yeah, they definitely do. And that is why there are limits to what the US can do in that particular affair. And the Chinese know that, and the US knows that. Now, China has taken, as Zoon mentioned, a very prudent and a very balanced line on this conflict. It is not providing weapons, but the West accuses that certain Chinese companies are providing components which are used for producing weapons, but this is something indirect. Directly, they're not providing weapons to Russia, while the Westerns are openly and clearly providing weapons and defense support to Ukraine.
So what I need to understand from this particular point is that if China is not providing directly any weapons to Russia for its conflict in Ukraine, on the other side, the Westerns are providing continuously the weapons, the lethal weapons, even the depleted uranium shells to Ukraine. In case if China starts providing direct lethal weapons to Russia, what would it entail?
You see, that would be a step that, which would signify that they are now getting directly involved in some ways. and something that I don't really see happening at this point in time. One of the points which are important are the US is in an election year. Trump has very different ideas in terms of Ukraine conflict than what President Biden has. And I think Russians, at this point in time, they would want to drag this conflict. There's a pretty strong possibility, or at least there's an even possibility that Trump would win the presidency. He's going pretty strong. Even if there's a 50% chance of it, then Russians would rather take that chance, because if Trump comes to power, he'd probably be willing to negotiate very differently than what President Biden is trying to do. The other strategy is to weaken the base, sort of, like by engaging with the European countries, and some of those countries are more forthcoming than the others, so to speak. So it's an interesting strategy that Russia is employing, and that is exactly why I believe that at this point in time, although there's in a position of strength, so it would not probably suit the Ukrainians and the Westerns to negotiate something at this point in time. So perhaps the conflict would drag to the end of the year, and then we'll see what happens in America, and that will have a profound impact on the course of the war.
So in that sort of a scenario, if former President Trump comes into power, so do you think he would right away back away from that particular support to the Ukrainians? And if that particular case happens, the way we have seen in his previous presidency, during his previous administration, the way the pattern, he was backing away from one thing and the other, the Iran nuclear deal as well as the Paris Climate Agreement, a number of other things also, right? So do you expect any sort of a backing right away from the support to Ukrainians?
I mean, he said that. What he said is, he's not said that he'll just kind of back off. What he said is that he can resolve, he will resolve this Ukraine conflict on the very first day of his presidency. He's made a very tall claim. But the fact is that Trump is known for that he could sort of, he can take 180-degree turns, or he could make decisions, very sort of, like strong decisions. And sometimes he could make decisions without taking his European allies into confidence. So because of that, because of his mercurial nature, and the fact that temperamentally he doesn't like wars, he doesn't like conflicts, and because he's a businessman, after all, and basically like his focus is on the economic most of the time. So I think that would be very interesting to see. Of course, like sometimes whatever you say does not happen in the same manner, but I think there would be there could be a sea change in terms of the Western.
Your point is well taken. Unfortunately, we're short of time. I'll have to end the show over here. Mr. Jauhar Saleem, former Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for your time. Mr. Mohammed Zamir, Assadi journalist and expert China Affairs, thank you very much for your time. On Skype, we were joined by Ms. Zoon Khan, Research Fellow, Center for China and Globalization. Ms. Zoon, thank you very much for your time also, for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.